the challenge that I observe in, especially in development, is that people assume that if you're a big agency or donor agency and you have the money, or even a corporate or an organization, and you can put clever people together, so-called formal stakeholders, in one room, that suddenly you will create impact. And this is the kind of a big development syndrome that we see in many countries. And often, as you say, it's top down in that it's so-called formal stakeholders that are brought in a table to bring what is called context. So when these programs get context, they bring a few people in the room, and then they ask, oh, what's the phenomenon about? And somehow from those few people, they get that. So the assumption there is that just by engaging a few people, even if it's experts, you now have the full context about that particular phenomenon, which is hugely problematic. And one of the big insights on complexity science or nonlinearity is to recognize that you need to balance formalized versus informal stakeholders. And often formalized stakeholders have one perspective about an issue and informal stakeholders have a separate one. And that's where maybe the power dynamics come in. And I'll show you some of the tricks to overcome that. Let me take this forward. So if the theory of change is not a good starting point, what could be an alternative start? And I just want to present to you, this is one, I'm sure there's many other ways, but this is called the challenge map. And I'll show you basically, it's got 3 areas, a very simple map. One area is the first is the main one is the vision. Although I don't like this concept of a vision because it's often associated with theory of change. I like instead what I call an organizing question that rallies people around a particular sort of cause. But anyways, if you like, you can use a vision. And then then what it does is it says, well, what are the problem areas that you foresee facing before in realizing that vision? And then underneath that, if you identify those problem areas, within each of those, there's what we call leverage points, which is very simply defined here as issues to be resolved. These issues are basically issues or opportunities. Issues or opportunities that you cannot achieve your vision without addressing. And I'll show you an example. And this is what we call leverage points. In other words, these are your big milestones. These are your big sort of areas that you need to really nudge to achieve what you want. Let me, because that might still sound abstract. So here's an example. My world is entrepreneurship. So I work across different African countries to try and create sustainable livelihoods and using entrepreneurship as a lever. So the question that often my clients ask is, how might we facilitate sustainable livelihood among youth in Africa? And these include African Union, German government, Canadian government, many Rwandan government, many of these governments and institutions I work with. If you like, it could be, oh, we would like an Africa where are thriving and independent, and you can state that as a statement rather than a question. I just like the question part because it creates more energy than this perfect idea, which is probably one of the biggest theory of change, is that there's often this picture that's static, and organizations sometimes don't change that for 100 years, even though the environment is changing. So I find that change a question, but the question that my world or my kind of stakeholders or my clients really try and ask is this question. And for entrepreneurship, there are 4 main areas. So one of them is talent, the other is funding, the other is policy, and the other is what we call acceleration. And an accelerator basically means training, mentorship, and all those support interventions. And talent means that people, when they're educated, they look for jobs. So they're educated for labor markets. Whereas when we create entrepreneurs, or if you're an entrepreneur, your mindset is entrepreneurial. So you gather your skills for what we call entrepreneurship as a career choice, as opposed to labor markets. And that's a huge, there's things around that as well. Part of that is mindset and etc. And then funding, and we all know many small businesses, or businesses, even if they're large, sometimes struggling with startup finance or growth finance. And then we have a bunch of policy issues. For example, in Tanzania, the environment, the policy environment is not favorable for entrepreneurship. If you contrast that to Rwanda and maybe Kenya, where government is very visible about promoting entrepreneurship. So in Tanzania, it's arguably more difficult to create a new business as opposed to Rwanda or Kenya. Anyways, if you just take any of these problem areas, this tool here uses problem area, but I also like to see this as an opportunity area. So if you look at talent as a main area to achieve sustainable livelihoods, you could hypothesize that actually mindset, you need to then influence people's mindsets about how to do that. Then you also need to create incentives for people to kind of consider entrepreneurship as a career. And then you need to build their competencies, so business and technical skills. And then you also need to support those that are local versus diaspora. So another pattern that we observe in Africa is that diaspora entrepreneurs are more successful than locals, just because they have the networks, they have the accent, and they have the household incomes that sometimes are better than those of locals. So those are just, for example, examples of leverage points. So what this means is that you cannot achieve sustainable livelihoods. You cannot build new businesses for young people, or young people can't build businesses unless on the talent front, you address mindset, intentions or incentives, competencies, and these dynamics of local versus diaspora. So that's just a hypothesis, which is very different from, by the way, you know, we will put together a training program. This is our inputs and this budget. And then we will have 5 sessions a month, which is activities. Let me get I'm going to annotate this, which is, yeah, we'll design this program with expert amount of budgets. Then we have 10 activities or 5 activities a month. Train these entrepreneurs, or we'll first select them and whatever, train them. Then somehow, because we've trained them, they will start businesses. So one output is business. When they start business, then great. One of the intended outcomes is that they must create jobs, you know, and when they create jobs, of course, they will improve household incomes and make people happy and make people satisfied, etc., which is a bunch of assumptions. For example, research suggests that training does not help create entrepreneurs, which is why it's not just the talent front, which is why it's not just talent issues. You need to address funding, you need to address policy, you need to address other things. Now, if you are one organization, like many hubs in South Africa and even parts of Africa, and maybe even if you are a Department of Trade and Industry, and you have all the money and etc., you could be operating from a funding paradigm, but unless you address talent issues and you have the state to fix policy, and then you train, mentor, network, etc., and orchestrate differently, you will not create entrepreneurs. So what this illustrates is that a simple sort of question or vision requires multiple praxis and multiple layers of intervening and understanding. And therefore, if I look at this, and I always tell my clients, and I say, well, why do you claim you will create entrepreneurs? Your vision is misleading. You cannot create entrepreneur, but you can contribute in that cause. So it's that distinction between contribution and attribution.